Greetings and welcome to today's presentation. We're glad you could join us today. Today's topic is flowers, a botanical approach. And I realize that flowers is a pretty massive topic to tackle. What we intend to do today is look at the idea. What is a flower? How are all flowers similar to one another? What parts are they made of? This is a botanical approach, just like the title says. We're not talking about how to grow flowers today. I'm afraid if that's why you've tuned in, we would like to maybe point you in the direction of some other programs that the University of Florida IFAS Extension has to offer on that subject. Today, we're going to dive in on what makes flowers flowers from a botanical perspective. My name is James Stevenson. I am with the University of Florida IFAS Extension here in Pinellas County, coming to you from Brooker Creek Preserve. You can take down my email address. It's gotten a little bit easier. First initial and last name, jstevenson@pinellas.gov. If you have any questions, comments, or complaints, or want to discuss anything any further by email, please don't hesitate to reach out. It's part of our job to bring research-based information to the citizens of our counties and surrounding counties, and through the medium of the internet, even further beyond. So thanks again for joining us today as we explore flowers. So the way that we have this lined out is we're going to start with the origin of the concept of flower, as it were. The flower is the reproductive structure of a particular group of plants, and the flower emerged at one point in the past and has diversified into the myriad of forms that we have today. We will, I guess, when I say we're going to learn floral morphology, I'm going to present floral morphology. It's up to you to do the learning part, so hopefully you will learn that part. And along the way, one inevitable outcome is that perhaps your mind will be just a little bit blown, in a good way, hopefully in a good way. So that's how we're doing this afternoon. So let us begin. We have plants on Earth, right? We all know this. We all see them when we look out our windows, doors. And generally speaking, human beings are blind to plants. We keep them literally in our periphery, in our peripheral vision. As humans, we're hardwired to look for patterns, and we see patterns and we notice the patterns that are most often associated with fellow animals. For many reasons, humans are hardwired to see animals. In modern life, of course, our attention is usually focused on objects that we have made and that we use every day. Plants exist in the periphery. It doesn't take much to switch that. And if you were to just try and practice, you could get very used to noticing differences between individual plants all around you. And once you start doing that, you may realize or begin to recognize that plants fall into very simple groups. And there's kind of only 4 different types of plant. And you can look outside and you can identify which one of the 4 groups each individual plant that you encounter falls into. There's one group that's called the mosses. They represent the most primitive, as it were, the simplest in composition, in its own structure, the mosses. They don't have any vascular tissue. They can't get very tall. They depend on osmosis to move water around their little bodies. They don't have roots or stems or leaves, but they are photosynthetic and they are land plants, and they reproduce by this ancient method, spores. Stepping up in complexity and along a timeline from when mosses began colonizing the earth, eventually diversified, mutated, and led to the arrival of a group of plants called the ferns, which you've probably heard of. That's our second group. They're more complicated in their structure. They have roots and stems and leaves. They still reproduce by spores, very ancient. Moving up in complexity, we have a group of plants that developed from a common ancestor of these previous two, and these are the conifers, the gymnosperms. For us, it's the pines, junipers, cedars. There's not very many, but you might recognize a conifer if you saw one. Everything else is a flowering plant. Everything else out there is a flowering plant. Whether you can picture the flower or not, it's a flowering plant. These are the most highly specialized of these plant groups. Their reproductive structures and system is extremely specialized and therefore is extremely efficient, which has led to a ability to streamline the reproductive process, which has led to the moving into of new habitats, new niches, and has led to the proliferation of species. So the flowering plants are the largest group of plants on Earth. We'll take a look at a few of the numbers. There's probably 13,000 modern moss species. 10,000 different ferns, only 1,000 different kinds of conifer. So individual species of these three groups of plants on Earth, the diversity isn't that great. They have kind of lost to the flowering plants. The flowering plants emerged after all of these other plant groups have had a go at living on land. The flowering plants, with their complexity, with their specialization, with their adaptability, exploded. And we have 300,000 known species of flowering plants. So again, if you look out the window and what you're looking at is not a moss, a little almost microscopic thing, not what's hanging in the trees, that's not a true moss. I'm talking about the little green velvet that grows on bricks. That's the mosses. And if it's not a fern, you could probably recognize a fern. And if it's not a conifer, it's a flowering plant. Everything else. So of these plants on Earth, where did all of this diversity come from? The mosses, with their kind of hidden lifestyle, look, this is all you get from a moss. These mosses are reproducing. They're making these little capsules full of spores. The spores are released and they grow into another tiny little green thing, kind of in the dark, kind of in the shade, kind of in a wet area. Those little green plants produce egg cells and sperm cells. Perhaps you've heard of these things. Rainwater washes over the top of the mosses and the little sperm can swims down to find the egg cell, and another spore capsule basically grows out, is developed from that fertilized egg. Of course, the ferns, we all know, have the specialized leaves, and on the backs of the leaves they have these dots. Everyone thinks that it's insect eggs that may have been laid in a perfect line, or maybe it's the insect themselves. Some people might think that the spots on the back of a fern frond around are the actual spores, but what we have in each one of these spotty areas, each one of these sori, are a collection of spore-producing structures, the sporangia. So each one of these golden dots on the back of the golden-foot polypody is a collection of sporangia, and inside the sporangia is up to 64 spores. So they're microscopically small. One sporangium with X number of spores, depending on the species. The spores are then released into the environment, carried on the wind. They're like dust. They grow into a separate plant. We have the egg and the sperm all over again. The zygote, or the embryo that follows, grows into the next generation of fern. It worked for the ferns for millions of years. One type of fern, in fact, the scouring rush, or equisetum, turned the fertile frond into a terminal cluster, kind of like a cone type structure. And this terminal spore-producing structure, looking very much like a cone, was a pretty good idea, sending spores from the top of the plant out across the landscape to land and grow into the next generation. That cone-shaped structure proved to be very efficient and quite a good idea. Reappeared in the next stage of plant evolution that still exists today, the conifers. And of course, we know that conifers produce cones. It's how they get their name, cone-bearing, also called the gymnosperms. These are the first plants. These are the first plants that still exist today that produce seeds. With the embryo and a little bit of food that embryo and food can detach from the parent plant and leave and germinate and grow. And you may recall a few months ago, the male cones of our native pine trees ripened and released their pollen. So the conifers are now the plants that have made these little flying sporangia called pollen that can drift through the air, being air transported, wind transported, to find the female cone. Here's the male cone, very small, produces billions of these little gametophytes with the gamete with the sperm cell inside, throws it in the wind. Here's a close-up of one of the scales of a male cone, each one of these little Mickey Mouse ear shaped. Those are the wings that are going to carry the gametophyte with the sperm inside over to, on the wind, over to the female cone. Land on the sticky female cone, germinate, fertilize, make an embryo, find that egg on the scale of the female cone. The female cone then develops over 2 or 3 years and releases the seed into the environment. That's the reproductive strategy, specialized, more efficient, still a little chancy throwing things into the wind. But the conifers developed, the conifers evolved, the conifers arose before there were insects to facilitate the movement of their pollen. The only thing around to send the message of pollen was the wind. Eventually, the insects and the conifers kind of overlapped, and there was a brief attempt between the insects and the conifers to have some sort of mutually beneficial relationship, but it didn't really last. Living conifers today, they do not produce any fruit. Their seeds are naked. Gymnosperms is the technical name for this group of plants, which means literally naked seeds. Their seeds are just loose. They might be ornamented, like these pine seeds, with a little wing-shaped structure, but they're not contained. The seeds are not contained in any way, in any nourishing type of structure. That nourishing structure belongs to the flowering plants, and everything else out there is a flowering plant. Whether right now you believe me or not, it's true. All the grasses, even the grass in your lawn, the palms, what else can I see? Weeds, all these things are flowering plants. They have roots, stems, leaves, and they use the flower as their reproductive structure. At the heart of the flower is a structure called an ovary. Maybe you've heard that before. An ovary containing the egg cells, and an ovary that protects and nourishes the developing seeds and provides some sort of dispersal mechanism to ensure, or at least to enable some sort of more efficient dispersal mechanism than just throwing seeds into the wind. Not that that's not always a bad thing. Not that that's always a bad thing. The southern magnolia represents a lineage of flowering plants that goes way, 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 way back. So one of the first groups of flowering plants is represented in the southern magnolia. And what's striking about the southern magnolia is it still kind of hangs on to that cone. Remember the scouring rush fern that made a cone, and then the cone is maintained, readapted in the conifers, and here we have it maintained and readapted in the flowering plants. The southern magnolia has its seeds contained within an ovary, not within a true cone. The ovaries in the center of this one flower are stacked into a conical type shape that you might be familiar with if you grow that plant. Water lilies are another modern group of an ancient lineage of flowering plants. And the water lily, with all of its petals, some of which, as you work your way from outside in towards the center of the flower, some of those petals begin to bear pollen. And that harkens back to, or at least reminds us of, the different components of a flower are derived from leaves that morphed into petals and morphed into reproductive structures. So all of these modifications of something that already existed, plants just took these structures that already existed and made them, repurposed them into a much more efficient system of reproduction. If you're familiar with anise, anise is another modern representative of an ancient lineage of flowering plants. So the anise tree, the water lily, and the magnolia have flowers that represent and resemble some of the very, very earliest of the flowering plants. A lot of their characteristics are very similar. The anise fruit, Elysium fruit, you can see the individual little ovaries that existed within the center of just one flower. Each one of these is going to dry, and the seed inside is going to have a little escape pod. This is the star anise, if you will. This is a native that we have, the native star anise. Some of the very, very first flowers have been identified in some fantastic fossil deposits in China. And this plant, Calianthus, was discovered in a formation that dated to about 125 million years ago. And it was so well preserved that individual structures could be very, very clearly identified based on modern species. So we have this plant that was found in a deposit, and the assumption was made that this plant, which could represent close to the very first flower, was aquatic. So it's very likely that flowers began their life attached to aquatic plants. There were plants on land. All the ferns, all the mosses, all the conifers, they were dominant. But in the water, in this aquatic habitat, this attempt, this mutation, this experiment in reproductive structures took hold. Why do we think it was aquatic? Because in the same formation was some fish skeletons as well. So that and some other context clues kind of gave scientists reason to believe that the first flowering plants appeared in the water. So let's take a look at this flower from Calianthus. The real thing here on the left and a schematic drawing on the right. And if you can picture a side view of any flower, this Calianthus has a lot of those parts. It has some leaves that are modified into petal-like structures that might serve to attract or funnel or both a potential pollinator, not the wind, offering something in return for being visited. There are structures that may provide nectar, may provide protein in the form of pollen or other proteinaceous substances as a reward or as a lure to bring insects to this structure to become the messengers and take the pollen to another flower of the same species. Within the fossil record, there are also evidence of ripened ovaries with seeds inside. So instead of just sitting on the edge of a pine cone scale, these are encapsulated into an ovary. A schematic but modern flower has all of the components that are shared amongst flowering plants. This is a side view of a typical flower. Remember I said everything out there that isn't a moss, a conifer, or a fern is a flowering plant. So somehow, somewhere, sometime, each one of those plants is going to produce a structure called a flower, and it is going to have these parts. We're looking at the flower from a side view, and we can see this is an exploded diagram. We can see there are 4 components: an outer whorl, an inner. Once in, we have these petal structures moving further in towards the center of the flower. We have these kind of drumstick looking structures. And then in the very center, we have the mystical middle. In this case, it's in 2 parts, but it's the mystic middle. And you know that inside each one of those structures, there will be at least 1 seed. It's time for some botany. It's time for some big words. The outer whorl of a flower is composed of modified leaves that are called sepals. Sepal. So in this diagram here, in this cutaway, this lateral section, you can see the outer whorl is made of these modified leaves called sepals. The next in towards the center of the flower is a whorl of modified leaves that are called petals. Maybe you've heard of those. The petals. Moving in towards the center of the flower, we have the stamens. Does that sound familiar? I bet you've heard that word before, maybe in 9th grade biology. The stamens. And finally, in the very center, we have one or more carpels, and that's the mystic middle. Because the carpel, each carpel, and they could be separate, they can be fused all together, but the carpels all have stigma, style, ovary, and inside the ovary is the egg that's going to become the seed. Streamlined and efficient for the reproductive thing, the reproductive cycle of the flowering plants. So those are the botanical words. In everyday language, we have the bud leaves, so the leaves that make the flower bud on the outside. Once those bud leaves peel back, the petals emerge. Then moving a little bit towards the center, more towards the center of the flower, the next row or whorl in are the boy bits, the bits that are going to make the pollen. And in the very, very center, the mystic middle, are the lady bits. The lady bits that are going to reproduce the species, because the lady bits have the eggs that are going to become the seeds. That's how all the flowers out there are put together. All the flowers out there are put together like this. They're all based on the same blueprint. Flowers evolved once. And all the flowers share a common ancestor with this arrangement. Some flowers might be missing one or more parts, but the blueprint is the same. A flower can be reductionist, it can be missing petals, it can be missing the mystic middle and just producing pollen, but it's still based on the same blueprint. A more typical flower has all the lady bits fused together. That's much more common than having the carpels or the individual lady bits separate from one another. They're much more often fused together into a single, unified ovary. Even though an individual carpel is a stigma style and ovary, once you fuse them all together in the typical configuration, that mystic middle, that one single unit, is referred to as the ovary. Still, we have the bud leaves, the sepals, the petals, the boy bits, the stamens, and the lady bits, stigma style and ovary, with the eggs inside. The eggs inside the ovary, there can be one egg per ovary, think avocado, or there can be many seeds per ovary, think tomato. Ovary contains egg. After pollination, fertilization of that egg happens. That's the purpose, the point of pollination, is to get the sperm down to the eggs. And once an embryo is formed, the seed develops. So the eggs inside the ovary become seeds. And an ovary, like I said, can have one seed, or it can have 25, 30, 50, 100 seeds. Depends on the species. Still the same blueprint The ovary contains one or more eggs that upon fertilization become seeds. You getting it? The seeds are safe inside the ovary as they develop. The seeds are attached to the ovary. And you'll love the word, maybe. The word where the seeds are attached to the ovary is called the placenta. Placentation. The ovary is literally feeding the developing seeds. The ovary is assisting in the development, the protection of a robust embryo, and the seed leaves that are going to feed the embryo as it germinates far away from the parent plant. So a ripe ovary with seeds inside. A flowering plant has an ovary, that mystic middle. It can be composed of carpels that are free or fused together. No matter what, the ripened ovary with a seed or seeds inside is called a what? Guess. It's called a fruit. A ripened ovary of a flowering plant. The ripened ovary of any flowering plant. All flowering plants produce an ovary. That ovary, when it's ripe with seeds inside, is called a fruit. We're going to do an hour on fruit, December 14th. Join us for that. It's true that there are a lot of fruit that are edible by not only humans, but animals. And edibility of fruit is one dispersal mechanism. Being swallowed, the seeds survive the journey through the digestive system and come out the other end, far away from the parent plant. But botanically speaking, fruit is a ripened ovary containing seeds. I don't care if you like to eat it or if your neighbor eats it. It doesn't have to be an edible thing to be a fruit. Botanically speaking, all it has to be is a ripened ovary. This anise pod, going back to our Florida anise, this star anise pod, these are those individual carpels that were at the center of a single flower. So each one of these swollen bits is a lone ovary. They're not fused together as is most common. More typical back in the day to be more independent, I guess, in the chronology of floral development. Anyway, inside each one of these ovaries is a seed or two seeds. And when that fruit is ripe, that fruit is dry when it's ripe, and it splits open to release the seed. So just because you can't make it into a smoothie doesn't mean that it's not a fruit. We're talking botany here. This is a fruit. This is a ripened ovary with a seed inside, and that seed has been nourished by the ovary tissues and is now ready to leave the parent plant and make its way in the world. The magnolia also has this composite of individual ovaries that are not fused together. And when those ovaries are ripe, they split to release the seeds inside. This kind of cone shape, hearkening back to the days of the conifers and even the little strobilus on top of the scouring rush. So those are some flowers that you hopefully are slightly familiar with, and perhaps in the case of star anise, you've had this structure in your hand and you can now relate that that is some ripened ovaries that are not fused together. But the diversity of flowering plants is vast. Vast. Their presentation, their color, their presence or absence of petals, their presence or absence of a nectar source. But at the very most basic level, all flowers are based on the same blueprint. The flowering plants have taken that blueprint and, along with their friends, the insects, literal friends, the insects, have diversified both. Insects have developed alongside the flowering plants to be their messengers in exchange for some sort of reward. And the rapid life cycling has led to generations and generations and experiments, adaptations, and the diversity that we have today is just phenomenal within the flowering plants. But they're still made of the same parts. As weird and complicated as a flower might look, if you tease out the extraneous bits, you will find the parts that we've already learned. The sepals on the outside, the bud leaves. Here we have a rose illustrating those modified leaves, those sepals. When they're associated with a flower, they're called sepals. And when they open, they reveal petals. The petals are the next world. They're modified leaves, but they have the job of, most often, attracting a pollinator or giving that pollinator a surface to land on and guide that pollinator towards the pollen-bearing structures, the stamens. The flower wants to get something in contact with the stamens because the stamens are covered in what? Pollen. And the plant wants to get its pollen away, and it wants to put it on something that can fly. So we have this stage that helps guide the pollinator towards the pollen itself. The stamens. Anybody know what the stamen is? The entire thing. Anybody know what the yellow dusty thing on the very end is called? Anybody want an extra credit in the chat or in the what's it called, Q&A? You can certainly send messages, questions, comments, or complaints throughout. Does anybody want to guess what that thing is called? It's part of the stamen. Mitch got in there. It's called the anther, or the anthers. The anther is where the pollen is produced. Well done, extra credit. All the flowers have this. I'm showing you all these different examples of flowers. They've all got these parts. And in the very, very middle, the mystic middle, we have the carpels. Usually, the carpels are all fused together, so you only see one lump, fat ovary, nice, fertile mother in the middle. But the original concept, which is maintained in certain species to this day, is to have all the carpels separate from one another. And here we are looking at a blackberry, which has the original configuration of a lot of individual carpels, with a stigma, a style, and an ovary, and a stigma and a style. They're all independent. They belong to the same flower. They're just sisters that don't talk to each other. And of course, if you can envision a blackberry, it is composed of a collection of individual little one-seeded fruits, one-seeded ripened ovaries, isn't it? That's the deal. Each one of those ovaries ripened into one of those little spheres that has a seed inside. Most other flowers will fuse all the carpels together, and so they all share, a skin, and they share a midsection, and they share placentation with their individual seeds. But here we have the individual carpels represented in a blackberry. See how easy that is? See how much you already knew? I'm just reminding you of all this stuff. So when now you go outside and you look at a tree and it's not a conifer, and you know it's not a fern. If it's not a conifer and it's an oak tree, my goodness, it's a flowering plant. And the flower has to be made of sepals and petals and anthers and carpels. It's easy. So again, moving from the outside in, 1, 2, 3, 4, we have the sepals that protect the developing flower. They get out of the way. All they do is protect the developing flower, then they get out of the way. Sometimes, though, sepals will stick around, and they may have something to offer in certain species, not just flower protection, but in some species, the sepals take on an elevated responsibility. In the Salvia genus, which we know as sage, the sepals are persistent. They stay attached to the plant. And here you can see the sage flower, this tubular, bi-lipped flower, an upper lip and a lower lip. And you can see the sepals that formerly were protecting those petals before they burst out to attract the pollinator. Once the pollinators have visited and fertilization has taken place, there's no need for the petals anymore. They just fall off. But in the case of salvia and a lot of its relatives, the sepals stay attached to the plant, and they kind of act to protect the developing ovaries on the inside. So they just miss the 2 intermediate whorls. They lose the 2 intermediate whorls once their jobs are done. And the little nutlets, the 4 little nutlets of sage, develop within the calyx, within the sepals. So sometimes sepals stick around. Here's the native lyre-leaved sage, which a lot of us have in, hopefully, a mixed lawn of some grasses, some weeds, broadleaf weeds, flowering plants like the lyre-leaf sage. And here we have those persistent calyces. And they'll dry and get crumbly, but persist and provide a little, what are they called in Hyli? This, I can't remember. Cessna, that they throw the, do you even know what I'm talking about? Anyway, the persistent sepals help the dispersal of the little dry nutlets. In the dandelion, which is a collection of a bunch of miniature flowers, the sepals this is an individual flower upside down. Its ovary is heels over head here, and the sepals have persisted. They have dried into this little parachute. So this flower only had the 1 ovary with the 1 seed inside. It held on to the sepals, and now the sepals are acting like a parachute to send this flying ovary into the world with its cargo, its single seed cargo. It was part of a composite of tiny little flowers all crowded onto the head of a dandelion. So a dandelion is not 1 flower, it's a whole bunch of little ones. In the lily and its kin, sometimes the sepals and petals, you can't really tell them apart. So the lily, you see these 6 petals. It's missing sepals. Well, no, not really. The sepals are modified to look just like petals. Doesn't really matter. They're kind of, in this case, the blueprint is in place. We've got petaloid stamens. Big deal. We still have the whorls. We have the mystic middle with the stigma and the style, and there's an ovary down there, blah, 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 life cycle. Got it? Orchids, where are the sepals? Well, they're related to the lilies, and they've got these petaloid sepals. These 1, 2, 3 orchids have a single modified petal that makes this crazy thing called a labellum, a landing strip. Same blueprint. They've just taken it and modified an existing part from the same blueprint. Moving in, we have the petals. As mentioned before, this is a crocus, one of those with petaloid sepals. The monocots have petaloid sepals. More about that if you take an advanced plant ID class. But for now, let's look at some pretty petals. This is a native, it's called roseling. It's a native camelinoid. Do you know spider flower? This is a relative of spider flower. Nice form equals function petals, advertising a nectar reward. Just visit these nice, pretty pink flowers and you'll get your nectar reward. When you're not looking, I'm going to cover you in pollen and you can take them to the next flower. Petals being a primary agent of attracting a pollinator have the surface area where they can afford to ornament that surface area to help mesmerize, hypnotize, guide, direct, convince their pollinators towards the goal of the plant. Plant could care less about the insect other than it's going to take my pollen away. And here's where I want you to go. In the case of the rose gentian, it's got this very clear instruction for the insect on just where to get to. Some flowers arrange their petals to kind of force the pollinator to do something in exchange for the nectar reward. You got to work for it. The work is going to pay off for both the insect and the plant, the flowering plant. This violet has what are referred to as bee guides on this one petal, not related to orchids in the least, not even close, but it's a similar pollination strategy by having this landing strip with lines on it that guides the pollinator in. But the violet flower has this thing called a spur. These petals are modified into this kind of backward facing petal modification with the nectar concentrated at the very dead end. So the pollinator has to work its way, there's those bee guides, it has to land on this petal and then walk backwards into the unknown. And in exchange for doing that work, it's going to get the nectar reward. And by doing the work, is going to be exposed to the pollen of the violet. That spur, that modified petal structure, isn't unique to violets. It's a strategy that works, and other flowers have picked it up. Again, we're comparing violets and orchids. Here we have Darwin's orchid. It has that bilaterally symmetrical flower, and it also has an incredibly long spur. This greenish white structure that I'm drawing the dot or arrow, whichever you see, down along, that is a spur that's something like 22 inches long attached to an orchid. Darwin never saw anything pollinate this orchid, but he used this plant as an example of a co-evolved agreement between a plant and an animal. And Darwin proposed that there must be an animal, likely an insect, that has a tongue that is 22 inches long. That is the only thing that can reach the nectar, and thus will be the only thing that visits the flower long enough to act as its pollinator. And this orchid, after Darwin made his prediction, proved him right. The moth, the sphinx moth, was discovered years after Darwin was long gone, but it proved him right, that there is this synergy coevolution, cooperation, efficiency, a single pollinator for a single species of flower. That's risky. On one hand, you're never going to waste pollen, and every flower is going to get pollinated and go to seed. But if anything ever happens to your pollinator, you're sunk. So anyway, side note, topic for another lecture on another day. A related species, the ghost orchid, you might have recently seen, its pollinator was recently identified as well. Another sphinx moth that has this incredibly low, I'm saying sphinx moth, like the sphinx in Egypt, and moth with this incredibly long proboscis that it can use to drink nectar. Other modifications to the petals can include nectaries, where obviously nectar is produced, kind of crude structures, not very finessed. They're just like modified petals that are pots of nectar. A hardly sublime way of presenting things, but it works for things like the hellebores. Petals can also be configured in such a way that they promote being visited by an animal with a long tongue or perhaps a long face. In the bromeliads, like the Florida air plant, they co-evolved with hummingbirds and are expertly sized and shaped to reward the hummingbirds with high energy nectar and to cover their little hummingbird foreheads with pollen when they visit. It's the same blueprint, just modifications on a blueprint. When I mentioned the 4 plant groups and we talked about the mosses being the least evolved, and that's the wrong way to put it, the most simple in structure, highly evolved flowering plant called Spanish moss has been given the name moss, heaven knows why, because it's not. It's an extremely highly evolved flowering plant that has taken the blueprint of being a plant and gotten rid of most things, streamlined, become efficient, not bothering with roots, just leaves and flowers, scales to eat humidity, and the little green, fragrant flowers, very attractive to moths. Doesn't even have to worry about competing with the day flying insects. Spanish moss are very highly evolved, very efficient. Another of the kind of funnel formed flowers, the jessamine, Carolina jessamine. And in jessamine, hopefully this photograph shows you that the petals are fused together. They're not individual. You can't loves me not with a jessamine because all the petals are fused into this trumpet shape. And that is clever, and it works for the jessamine in getting the pollinator down into a one-way dead-end street so that in order to escape, it's got to turn around and come back out covered in pollen. Good pollination syndrome. Mirrored in a separate group of flowering plants, the morning glories. You know this to be true, that the petals are fused. You can count it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals. Each one of these little points represents an individual, but they're fused together into this trumpet shape. You got to hand it to the orchids. They've got pollination down. It's why of the flowering plants, there are more species of orchids than any other of the flowering plants. There's hundreds, nay thousands of orchid species because they've got pollination syndromes knocked out. And some of the stuff they do is, I'd hate to say mean. Um, the grass pinks, these are photographs that were taken here at Brooker. Orchid flowers, they're upside down. Here's that lip that's usually the landing strip, but here it's being held straight up. You see the yellow fuzz. Looks like anthers, doesn't it? They're not. Those are fake anthers. The orchid is betting that an insect is going to see a patch of yellow fuzz and think, I know if I go into that thing, there's going to be a nectar reward. So I'm going to go into that thing. And the insect flies in and goes into that thing. Now, again, these are fake. There's no nectar, there's no pollen, there's no reward. There's just these fake anthers. When the insect lands on this fake patch of anthers, the weight of the insect brings this whole petal down, and it hits this structure like a hammer. It swings down under the weight of the insect and hits this flattened structure here. You can barely see it in the white flower here, but it's this kind of, that's where the pollen sac is located, and it knocks the insect onto the pollen sac. And when the insect realizes that it's been duped and flies away, it's got a pollen bag wrapped around its neck. So then when it goes and tries it again, and it falls backwards, the necklace slips off on the next grass pink flower. That's just the tip of the iceberg with the orchids when it comes to tricking their pollinators. A legume, all the legumes have the sweet pea shaped, nope, that's not true. There are 3 groups of legume flowers. One group has the sweet pea shaped flowers with the big banner flower and a keel, a keel which is shaped like the keel of a boat, and 2 wing petals. Basically, again, like the violet, this is an obstacle course for the pollinator to follow these guides and then get lost in this mess of chutes and ladders and corners and crevices and secret tunnels and everything else. And finally, when it breaks its way back out, it's had its nectar reward, gets its bearings back, and it just happens to be covered in pollen. The iris is another flower that requires its pollinator to work for its reward. This is an iris flower behind me. You can see the nice yellow bee guide, very enticing. But once the insect gets past that event horizon and they start working their way down into the depths of the individual flower, it's hairy and scary, and they just kind of scramble and struggle and twist and turn and finally find the nectar reward and eventually get their way back out covered in pollen. Other flowers, some native wildflowers, stargrass, not a grass, but has a star-shaped flower. Pretty straightforward. A landing pad, very efficient. I have 1 petal. I'm going to put 1 stamen on each petal so that if an insect lands on this petal and walks in, they'll get the nectar reward. And when they back out, lobelia has that entry-exit kind of situation. But then I mentioned earlier, there's the oaks. And I just told you that they're flowering plants because they're not moss and they're not ferns and they're not conifers. They're flowering plants because they have to be. But can you picture an oak flower? Well, you can. You just probably didn't realize that that's what they were. In the springtime, the oak produces flowers. reductionist flowers. One flower is based on the blueprint, but it's missing petals and it's missing carpels. It's still a flower, it's just missing carpels and petals. So what's left? Just stamens. So these are little ropes, little chains of tiny little flowers that are missing parts, but they have the parts that produce the pollen. So these are ropes of tiny little individual flowers that are nothing but stamens. These are called the male flowers. These are what send all the pollen into the air and then drop down on our cars. The oaks are a group of plants that have gone back to using the wind as their pollen messenger. Even though insects are freely available, the oaks have found a certain economy in producing only clouds of pollen rather than the expense of a nectar reward and big showy petals that cost a lot of reserves to create only for a day. The oaks have gone back to using the wind as an economic. So it produces these male flowers that hang out into the wind and throw pollen into the wind that drift and find the female flowers. Same blueprint, but it's missing petals. And this female flower is missing stamens. So what's all that's left are the carpels. So they're just carpellate flowers. This is an entire flower. Miniature, not microscopic, but miniature. It's got these kissy lips that are sticky to grab pollen out of the air. They don't need an insect bringing it to them. They can kissy the pollen right out of the sky as long as it's blowing past. The ovary then develops into what? Ripened ovary is called a what? Ripened ovary with a seed inside is called a what? Fruit. The acorn is the fruit of the oak. Grasses, how are we doing? Getting there. Grasses, all the grasses. Bermuda grass, St. Augustine grass, lopsided Indian grass, corn, wheat, barley, rye. What are some other grass? Sand spurs type of grass. These are all flowering plants. They too lack petals. They too depend on the wind to move their pollen around. But their individual flowers are still based on that same ancient blueprint. They just don't bother making extraneous parts. In the lopsided Indian grass, you can see the rust-colored stamens hanging out, literally hanging out in the wind. Wind's going to carry their pollen to the next plant where it has feathery stigmas attached to the ovaries that are going to grab pollen out of the air, fertilize the egg inside, and grow into their fruit. And grass fruit is called a grain. More on fruit next month. Moving on in, we have the stamen. So that's petals, present and absent. Stamens, the part that make the pollen. On close inspection, pollen is like dust. It's not very many cells, a pollen grain. Here we have an anther with individual pollen grains inside. Each pollen grain is like a little plant, a little messenger plant that's going to fly or is going to be carried by a pollinator. If you're carried by a pollinator, all you need to do is stick to that pollinator. If you're going to fly and be wind carried, pollen needs to be lightweight, very lightweight. It needs to be protected from UV radiation because it's going to be exposed to the sun as it travels through the atmosphere. And it will also, wind pollinated species, the pollen will also have to have, usually, some sort of armature so that when it does reach a destination, it will stay there. So wind carried pollen is very often embellished with some sort of surface relief, spines, hooks. It's why plants that produce pollen that is meant to be wind dispersed, when it gets in our nose, it's irritating. Pollen's made of protein. We might be allergic to the proteins. Pollen, wind dispersed pollen can have hooks and barbs on it, so it could be a physical irritant. But pollen that sticks to bees, pollen that sticks to flies, pollen that sticks to, sphinx moth forehead, that's not going to give us any respiratory distress because we're never going to come in contact with it. It's funny when I see like what is it called? Goldenrod. Goldenrod gives you allergies. No, it doesn't. Goldenrod is a showy yellow flower that has sticky pollen that sticks to a bee. You're never going to contact goldenrod pollen. You're going to come in contact with some airborne pollen from a flower that doesn't even have any petals, that you've never even seen before because it doesn't have any petals. What was I talking about? Stamens that make pollen. Okay. If you grow sunshine mimosa, you might see these little pom-poms. Those are its flowers. This is another composite of tiny little flowers. The petals are reduced to scales, but the stamens stick out towards pollinators. And the stamens themselves are brightly colored. So in the sunshine mimosa, the role of attracting the pollinator has been handed over to the stamens. Here, you do it. And the petals just reduce, get out of the way of the pollinators. That way, a whole bunch of flowers can be crowded into a very small space, kind of gambling on at least one of those ovaries is going to have an egg that gets fertilized inside of it. The purpose of making pollen is to lose the pollen to another individual of your same species. So for insect pollinated plants, the pollen is sticky. It has to adhere to the pollinator. Some pollinators actively and intentionally collect pollen. I mentioned before that it's very high in protein. Many bees will collect pollen and feed it to their young. But they can't get all of that off of themselves. And some, even if the insect is collecting pollen for its own consumption, some will be transferred as long as it visits a flower of the same species. Butterflies, crap pollinators, absolute junk. I'm not saying they never do, but the flower has to have a lot of trickery in order to facilitate pollination by a butterfly. Because look at butterflies, they're on their tiptoes. They just walk around. They don't want to get their feet wet. They don't want to get their feet dirty. They don't want to encounter any of that pollen at all. They just have this really long tongue. They can maneuver their tongue. They can like an elephant trunk. They can like wiggle it around and stay away from the dirty pollen and just drink the nectar and fly off without transferring any pollen at all. So plants have to adjust for that. Plants have to adjust for nectar thievery, and milkweed has done just that. Milkweed's not going to let somebody just come and steal its nectar. It's going to make things hard, and it's going to use a little bit of tactical intelligence, the milkweed. Here's a typical milkweed flower. It's got reflexed sepals And then the petals are modified into this corona structure, and they're very waxy, they're very slippery. And in between each petal, there sits a little bag of pollen. You see that brown, these brown dots in between each of the petals? Those brown dots are like a vise with pollen bags attached. And the petals are slippery. So we have this nectar thief butterfly hanging out, and it steps on a petal and it slides in between the two petals, and it gets clamped, its leg gets clamped with one of these vice grips that have packets of pollen. So it's not dusty pollen, they're contained in a little lunchbox of pollen. This happens to be a bee leg, but the milkweed doesn't care whose leg it is. It's going to attach its pollinia, its pollen bags, to anything that tries to steal its nectar. So plants are keeping up with the potential nectar thieves. Here's another bee with pollinia attached to his legs. Rosinweed doesn't have this. Rosinweed is here being nectar thieved. Hopefully something hairy will come along and fertilize, pollinate the poor rosinweed. Rosinweed is related to golden eyes. These are the daisies. And when I showed you a photograph of dandelion, I told you there was a bunch of little flowers in the flying ovary with the modified sepals of the parachute. Here you can see that in a relative of the dandelion and of the rosinweed and of all the daisies, you can see the little flowers, each of these individual flowers clustered on a shared stage. Each one of those flowers has an ovary. Each one of those flowers has sepals and petals and anthers and an ovary. So these are a bunch of tiny little flowers. These flowers around the outside have got outsized petals that act like individual petals of a single flower. So this again is adaptation to be more efficient, packing a lot of reproductive potential into a very small spot. Instead of giving all of this real estate over for just one flower with one ovary, this real estate is modified and streamlined so that a dozen flowers can fit in the same amount of space. It's a characteristic of this sunflower family, and it has made the sunflower family the most successful of its group of flowering plants. The orchids are king overall, but the next rank down would be the sunflower group, because they have this extremely streamlined way of doing things, crowding a whole lot of reproductive potential into a small spot. And if we zoom in on the heart of a sunflower, we'll see the nice little lined up sunflower seeds. Each one of those is a ripened ovary. Each one of these is a ripened ovary. Each one of these is a ripened ovary. These aren't seeds. These aren't seeds. These aren't sunflower seeds. What are they? They're ripened ovaries. These are sunflower fruits. Dried fruits with the seed inside. Okay? Ripe ovary with seeds inside, or a seed, is called a fruit. Right. Okay. Look, a ripened ovary with seeds inside. Remember, you're a botanist now. Get out of your nutritional mindset and call it what it is technically. Not at the grocery store, but here amongst botanical friends. Coconut, look, it's a ripened fruit. It's a ripened ovary with a single seed inside. Look, it's a fruit. A sand spur. It's a ripened ovary with a seed inside. It is a fruit. Technically, it is a fruit. Not from the USDA perspective, no. But from a botanical perspective, yes, the technical word is fruit. See? Again, see how easy that is? It's so easy. And it's all right there. You can observe all this all day, every day. You can go out and look for flowers, look for fruit. Imagine the pollination syndrome. Imagine the dispersal mechanism. The dispersal mechanism for a sand spur, it's provided by the ovary. It's these spines that stick to dogs and flip-flops and things. That's how these plants get around. We'll save all that for fruit next month. I think you're good. I'm going to look at a couple of questions. I'm going to take a drink of water. That's probably enough for today. We do have a lot of recorded webinars. If you haven't already discovered them, navigate towards our UF IFAS Extension Pinellas County YouTube channel. I believe today's presentation, if not today's, then a version of today's will be posted. Do check out that channel for some more learning. So now I'll take a drink of water. If we have a poll, we'll set out a poll for you all to take. Here we go. We'd love for you to answer these questions. And I'll pause here for just 1 second. If you can see the poll on your screen, go ahead and make your choices. It's just a couple of relatively easy questions. All right, while y'all are finishing up the poll, I'll take a look at some of the questions. So we'll go way back to the conifers. What about pine nuts? Wouldn't pine nut be a fruit? You probably answered your own question now. When we have the four main groups of plants, the mosses, the ferns, the conifers, and the flowering plants, fruit belongs to the flowering plants because fruit is a ripened ovary. The pine nuts come from a real pine, and pines do not have a fruit. They do not have protected seeds. They have naked seeds, so they don't have a fruit. A pine nut is a seed. And also having an air plant that's just coming into flower, that's great. You can watch the progress. You can see the petals dry up and fall away. You can watch these things happen in real time. And we got to thank you. We thank you very much for joining us. Bats as pollinators, that's great. Esther would like to raise the subject of bats as pollinators. Well, flowers need to have some sort of messenger, and talked a lot about insects being that messenger, talked a bit about the wind being that messenger, taking the pollen from one plant to another. But of course, birds, we mentioned one vertebrate, a bird. The bromeliads kind of co-evolved with the bromeliad group, hummingbirds and bromeliads. But in other climates and other places, of course, the flowers will take advantage of anything. Not in Florida, but in the desert, certain species of cactus, not just cactus, but cactus, take advantage of the fact that there are bats that fly around at night when it's cool. So the cactus will open their flowers at night, presenting a nectar reward to the bats that are flying at night. It benefits the cactus in that it's not opening its flower in the middle of a blast furnace, which would evaporate everything good away from it. So it can flower at night. Other plants use birds like the bird of paradise. If you have a bird of paradise, you could approach the bird of paradise and gently press down on its blue flat stage-like petal, and you'll see that it will split in half under the weight of a little bird foot and cover that bird's foot. So there are all kind of pollination syndromes, a subject for another presentation, of course, but yes, the flowers are built to maintain a pollination syndrome that could be very specialized, like Darwin's orchid, or could be very generalistic, like the southern magnolia, where it's just a big platter with anthers in the middle that says, come and get it. All right, thanks for answering the poll questions. I will sign off, except I've just got one more. You've got a passion flower. Do you know passion flower? This is crazy. It doesn't look right. It cannot be the same blueprint because it's just nuts, but it is the same blueprint. If you were to approach a passion flower, preferably one that belongs to you, and start taking it apart, you will find the basics: sepals, petals, stamens, and the mystic middle. Passion flower, though, is configured crazy town. And you can see it's got this weird kind of pedestal. It's got this suspended, perched ovary way up here. It's got these 3 arms that are 3 individual stigmas that it holds straight up, and then it points the anthers down. So it's already got this crazy architecture, but it works just great. When a bee lands on these purple spaghetti, and starts walking around, its back gets dusted like a shoe brush with the pollen. And on the first day, when the pollen is being shed, these sticky stamens are way up here out of the way because they don't want to get their own pollen on them. That's selected against in flowering plants. Being pollinated by your own pollen is kind of factored out using various techniques. But in the case of the passion, it just holds its sticky stigma away from its own pollen. Once all the pollen is shed, it then bends them down. Can you see here where they're bent down to the same level as the bee is going to be dancing around the purple spaghetti? And then it's going to pick up some pollen. The stigma is going to pick up some pollen from a neighboring plant, a separate individual. So it's just nuts, and it's really worth getting your eye in on, looking at flowers in a whole new way. Imagine their pollination syndrome. Look for the individual pollinators. See if the pollinator is successful in picking up pollen. Luckily, we live in an area where we've got some flowers year-round. So I couldn't help it. I just had to tell you that story about the passion vine. That's enough for today. Appreciate your attention. Okay, goodbye and have a great